This 1901 studio photo looks like a friendly partnership until you see the contract. At first glance, it is the portrait of two businessmen, one white, one black, both dressed carefully for the photographer. But when you look closer at the rolled paper tucked under the white man's arm, you begin to understand that this image was never about partnership at all. It was about ownership. Dr. Evelyn Morris found the photograph in a cardboard box at a county historical society in rural Alabama. She had been cataloging photographs from estate donations for 3 years. Most were straightforward: family gatherings, church groups, school classes from the turn of the century. This one arrived with a collection from the Whitfield family, prominent merchants in Tallapoosa County since the 1880s. The photo shows two men standing outside a wooden storefront. The white man is Thomas Whitfield. He wears a pressed suit, watch chain visible, hat held at his side. He stands slightly forward, shoulders squared to the camera. Beside him is a black man whose name is not written anywhere on the photograph. He wears work clothes, clean but worn. His hands rest at his sides. Both men look directly at the lens with neutral expressions. Behind them, painted letters on the storefront window advertised dry goods, feed, and hardware. Evelyn almost filed it with the other merchant portraits. Then she adjusted the desk lamp and saw it. Tucked under Whitfield's left arm is a rolled document. The edges are slightly unfurled. In the magnified scan, you can see handwriting, legal language, and at the bottom, where a signature should be, there is only an X. Not Whitfield's signature, the other man's mark. Evelyn leaned back from the monitor. She had seen hundreds of X marks in historical records. Illiteracy was common in rural Alabama in 1901, but something about the composition felt deliberate. This was a studio portrait. People chose what to bring into the frame. Whitfield had chosen to hold that document. He had chosen to stand beside this worker and have their picture taken together, contract visible. She zoomed in on the black man's face again. His expression was not quite neutral. There was a flatness to it, a careful absence of anything that might be read as emotion. This was not just a pretty old photo. Something here was wrong. Evelyn Morris had been working in Southern archives for 12 years. She had a PhD in public history from a university in Georgia and had spent most of her career untangling the documentary aftermath of slavery and Reconstruction. She knew the visual language of power: plantation owners posing with their field workers, white families photographed with black domestic servants arranged like furniture, images meant to project benevolence while encoding control. But those were usually from before 1865. This was 1901, nearly 40 years after emancipation. She worked methodically. She removed the photograph from its sleeve and examined the back. There was a photographer's stamp, J.R. Bellamy Studio, Alexander City, Alabama. A date penciled in faded script, April 1901. And below that, in different handwriting, 2 words: contract day. She pulled out her phone and photographed the back, then the front, then the magnified detail of the document under Whitfield's arm. She could make out fragments of text: term of service, advance payment, penalties for breach. That night she could not sleep. She kept thinking about the phrase, contract day, as if it were an occasion, something worth commemorating. The next morning she started with city directories. Thomas Whitfield appeared regularly. He owned Whitfield General Merchandise in Alexander City from 1887 until his death in 1923. His obituary described him as a pillar of the community, member of the Methodist Church, supporter of local schools, generous employer. She cross-referenced the 1900 census. Whitfield's household included his wife, 3 children, and 2 black men listed as laborers living on the property. No last names, just first names and ages. One of them, listed as Samuel, 28, seemed like the right age to match the man in the photograph. She needed more context. She called James Rutherford, a historian at Tuskegee University who specialized in post-Reconstruction labor systems in Alabama. He agreed to meet her at a coffee shop halfway between their offices. Rutherford spread the photograph across the table between them. He studied it in silence for a long moment. "Do you know what this is?" he asked quietly. "I think it's a labor contract," Evelyn said. "It's a debt contract," Rutherford corrected, "and in Alabama in 1901 that made him a slave in everything but name." He explained. After the Civil War, Southern states passed laws designed to re-enslave black workers without technically violating the 13th Amendment. Vagrancy laws criminalized unemployment. Convict leasing laws allowed counties to rent out prisoners to private employers. And labor contract laws allowed merchants and landowners to advance small amounts of money or goods to black workers, then bind them to years of labor to repay debts that could never be satisfied. The contracts were legal, backed by state law, enforced by sheriffs and judges. If Samuel tried to leave, Rutherford said, tapping the photograph, Whitfield could have him arrested for breach of contract. The fine would be added to his debt. He'd be sent to a labor camp or leased back to Whitfield to work it off. The debt would grow faster than he could ever work. How common was this? Evelyn asked. Extremely. Thousands of black men across Alabama, tens of thousands across the South. Rutherford paused. The question is, why did Whitfield want a photograph of it? That question stayed with Evelyn for days. She returned to the Tallapoosa County Courthouse and requested access to civil records from 1900 to 1905. She found dozens of cases, black men sued for breach of labor, contracts, fined amounts they could never pay, their terms of service extended again and again. She found Whitfield's name in 7 separate cases. Samuel appeared in one, listed by last name this time, Samuel Grant. In 1903, he was sued for leaving Whitfield's employment before his contract term ended. The judgment ordered him to pay a $75 fine plus court costs or work an additional 18 months. The records showed he chose the labor. She found no record of him after 1904. Evelyn needed to see the location. She drove 2 hours to Alexander City and found the site where Whitfield's store once stood. It was now a parking lot beside a dollar store. Across the street was the old Tallapoosa County Jail, a brick building from 1890, still standing but converted into apartments. She walked the downtown blocks, trying to imagine Samuel Grant walking these same streets in 1901, bound by a piece of paper, watched by a system designed to catch him if he ran. At the Alexander City Public Library, she requested microfilm of the local newspaper, The Outlook, from 1900 to 1905. She scrolled through weeks of civic announcements and advertisements. Then she found a small article dated March 1901. Local merchants urged to formalize labor agreements. The article explained that county officials were encouraging all employers of Negro labor to use standardized contracts that clearly outlined terms, advances, and penalties. It would reduce disputes, the article claimed, protect both employer and worker. But Evelyn knew better. These contracts were not protections, they were traps. She found another article from July 1902, a brief report on a county meeting about labor unrest. Several black workers had been arrested for vagrancy after attempting to leave their employers. The article quoted the sheriff praising the contract system for maintaining order. She photographed every page. Back in her office, Evelyn contacted the Alabama Department of Archives and History. A research librarian directed her to a collection she had not known existed, records from the Alabama Board of Inspectors of Convicts, created in 1903 to monitor conditions in labor camps after scandals about deaths and abuse. The reports were horrifying. Men worked in coal mines, turpentine camps, lumber mills, on chain gangs building roads. Dozens died each year from exhaustion, disease, violence. The reports documented deaths but rarely used the word murder. In a report from 1904, she found this line: "Convict labor continues to be supplemented by contract labor under county jurisdiction, a system which inspectors are not authorized to monitor." The contract system existed parallel to convict leasing. It operated in private, on farms, in stores, and workshops, hidden in plain sight. Evelyn called Rutherford again. "I need to understand the legal structure," she said, "how this was justified." He referred her to a law professor at the University of Alabama, Dr. Patricia Lansing, who had written about debt peonage prosecutions in the early 20th century. They met in Lansing's office, surrounded by legal histories and case files. Lansing explained that the system depended on 3 interlocking laws. First, vagrancy statutes that made unemployment itself a crime. Second, contract enforcement laws that made breach of a labor contract a criminal offense, not just a civil matter. Third, convict leasing laws that allowed prisoners to be handed over to private employers. The contracts were designed to be unbreakable, Lansing said. Employers advanced goods or money at inflated prices, charged for housing and food, imposed fines for lateness, illness, or unsatisfactory work. The workers' debt grew faster than their wages. Even if they worked for years, they would never be free. And this was legal? Evelyn asked. It was legal under Alabama law, Lansing said. It was not legal under federal law. The 13th Amendment bans involuntary servitude, but the federal government rarely prosecuted these cases until after 1905, and even then only a handful. Lansing pulled a file from her cabinet. There was a major case in 1903, United States v. Reynolds. The Supreme Court ruled that Alabama's criminal contract enforcement law was unconstitutional, but by then, thousands of men had already been trapped, and even after the ruling, many states just found new ways to enforce the same system. Evelyn thought about Samuel Grant, photographed in April 1901, sued in 1903, disappeared after 1904. She asked Lansing if there was any way to know what happened to men like Samuel once they vanished from the civil records. Lansing looked at her for a long moment. Sometimes they died, sometimes they escaped, sometimes they were sold to another employer under a new contract, and the cycle started over. Evelyn left the meeting with a thick folder of photocopied legal documents. She felt the weight of them in her bag as she walked to her car. That night she started drafting a research report. But she realized a report was not enough. This photograph was not just evidence of one man's exploitation. It was evidence of a system, and that system had never been fully reckoned with. She contacted the director of the County Historical Society, Margaret Odom, and requested a meeting to discuss the photograph and its implications. They met in the Historical Society's small conference room. Evelyn brought printed copies of everything she had found: census records, court documents, newspaper articles, legal analysis. She laid them out on the table alongside a large print of the photograph. "I think this image needs to be reinterpreted," Evelyn said carefully. "It's been filed as a merchant portrait, but it's actually documentation of debt peonage." Margaret studied the materials in silence. She was in her 60s, a retired schoolteacher who had volunteered at the Historical Society for 15 years. Her family had lived in Tallapoosa County for generations. "This is a serious accusation," Margaret said finally. "Thomas Whitfield's descendants still live here. They've donated a lot to this organization." "I'm not accusing anyone of anything they didn't do," Evelyn said. "I'm saying we need to tell the full story. That contract under Whitfield's arm was part of a legal system of forced labor. Samuel Grant was not a willing employee. He was trapped." Margaret folded her hands on the table. "How do you know Samuel wasn't happy with the arrangement? Maybe he needed the work." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. She had anticipated this response, but it still stung. "He was sued for trying to leave," she said evenly. "If he was happy, why would he try to leave? And why would Whitfield need a legal mechanism to force him to stay?" Margaret did not answer immediately. She looked at the photograph again, at Samuel Grant's careful, expressionless face. "I need to bring this to the board," Margaret said. "We can't just change the interpretation of a donated photograph without consultation." Evelyn agreed, though she felt uneasy. The board meeting happened 3 weeks later. Evelyn was invited to present her findings. She stood at the front of a small room with 8 board members seated around a table. Most were white, older, long-time residents. One was a black woman named Claudia Moore, a retired librarian. Evelyn walked them through the research. She showed the photograph, the contract visible under Whitfield's arm. She explained the legal structure of debt peonage in Alabama. She presented the court case, the newspaper articles, the evidence of Samuel Grant's lawsuit and disappearance. "What I'm proposing," Evelyn said, "is that we create an exhibit around this photograph, that we tell the story of debt peonage in Tallapoosa County, that we make visible what this image has hidden for more than a century." One board member, an older man named Richard, spoke first. "I appreciate your research, Dr. Morris, but I'm concerned about how this will be perceived. The Whitfield family has been very supportive of our work here. This feels like we're accusing them of something their great-great-grandfather did." "We're not accusing anyone," Evelyn said. "We're correcting the historical record." Another board member, a woman named Susan, chimed in. "But how do we know your interpretation is correct? Maybe this was just a regular employment contract. Maybe Samuel Grant was genuinely grateful for the work." Evelyn took a breath. With respect, the court records show he was sued for leaving. The law at the time made breach of these contracts a criminal offense. This was not free labor. It was coerced. Claudia Moore leaned forward. She had been quiet until now. I've been listening, Claudia said, and I think Dr. Morris is right. My own great-grandfather was caught in a system like this. He worked for a sawmill in Coosa County. He tried to leave and was arrested, spent 6 months on a chain gang. My grandmother told me stories about it. When I was a child, this was real. This happened to thousands of families. The room went quiet. Claudia continued, if we don't tell this story, we're saying it didn't matter. We're saying those men's lives didn't matter. I think we have an obligation to tell the truth. Richard shifted in his seat. I understand that, Claudia, I do. But we have to think about funding, about donors, about community relations. What about our mission? Claudia said. Doesn't our mission statement say we're here to preserve and interpret the history of this county? All of it? Margaret, the director, intervened. Let's take a vote. All in favor of moving forward with Dr. Morris's proposed exhibit on debt peonage, including the Whitfield photograph. 5 hands went up. 3 did not. The motion passed. Evelyn felt relief, but also exhaustion. She had won the vote, but the resistance had been real. She knew the next phase would be just as hard. Over the next 6 months, Evelyn worked with a small team to build the exhibit. She brought in Rutherford and Lansing as consultants. She hired a local designer to create panels with enlarged images, excerpts from legal documents, and timelines of the debt peonage system in Alabama. The centerpiece was the photograph. It was printed large, mounted on the wall with a spotlight, and beside it, a panel explained what viewers were really seeing. The panel read, "This 1901 photograph shows Thomas Whitfield, a merchant in Alexander City, standing beside Samuel Grant, a black laborer bound to Whitfield under a debt contract. The document visible under Whitfield's arm was likely the contract itself. Under Alabama law at the time, such contracts allowed employers to trap black workers in cycles of debt that functioned as a form of slavery. Samuel Grant was sued for breach of contract in 1903 and forced to extend his labor. His fate after 1904 is unknown." Evelyn also tracked down descendants of Samuel Grant. It took months of work following census records and family trees, contacting churches and funeral homes. She finally connected with a woman named Rose Grant Thompson, Samuel's great-great-granddaughter, who lived in Birmingham. Rose agreed to come to the exhibit opening. She brought her daughter and 2 grandchildren. When Rose saw the photograph for the first time, she stood in front of it for several minutes without speaking. Evelyn stood beside her, waiting. "I never knew what he looked like," Rose said finally. Her voice was soft. "My grandmother told me stories, but we didn't have pictures. She said he disappeared when she was a baby. Nobody knew what happened to him." "I'm sorry I couldn't find more," Evelyn said. Rose shook her head. "You found him. You told his story. That's more than we've ever had." The exhibit opened in October. Attendance was modest at first, mostly locals, but word spread. A journalist from the Montgomery Advertiser wrote a feature story. A regional NPR affiliate did a radio segment. Within a few months, busloads of school groups were coming through. Not everyone was happy. Evelyn received emails from members of the Whitfield family, some angry, some defensive, a few thoughtful. One descendant, a man named David Whitfield, came to see the exhibit himself. He stood in front of the photograph for a long time, reading the panel. Afterward, he found Evelyn in her office. "I don't know what to do with this," David said. "My whole life I was told my great-great-grandfather was a good man, that he gave jobs to people who needed them." "He probably believed that," Evelyn said carefully. "But the system he participated in was not good. It was exploitation dressed up as opportunity." David nodded slowly. "I guess I need to sit with that." He left, and Evelyn never heard from him again, but she hoped something had shifted. The exhibit's success led to broader changes. The County Historical Society revised its mission statement to explicitly commit to addressing difficult histories. Other historical societies across Alabama reached out, asking for guidance on reinterpreting their own collections. Lansing used the case as an example in her law classes, and Rose Grant Thompson returned to the exhibit several times. She brought family members, showed them the photograph, told them the stories her grandmother had passed down. One afternoon, she asked if she could have a copy of the photograph. Evelyn printed one for her, mounted and framed. "He wasn't just a victim," Rose said as she held the frame. "He tried to leave. He resisted. That matters too." Evelyn nodded. She thought about Samuel Grant standing in front of that camera in April 1901, contract day. knowing that the paper under Whitfield's arm bound him to years of labor he could not escape, knowing that the photograph itself was another form of documentation, another way of asserting control, but also standing there, present, visible, his face recorded for history. There are thousands of photographs like this one. Portraits from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, displayed in museums and archives and family albums, misread as evidence of harmony or progress or paternalistic care. They show white landowners with black workers, white families with black servants, white employers with black laborers. The compositions suggest partnership, even affection. But when you look closer, when you read the documents and trace the legal structures, and listen to the stories passed down through generations, you begin to see something else. You see the contracts tucked under arms, the chains disguised as jewelry, the expressions carefully controlled to avoid giving offense, the hands positioned just so, revealing restraint or encoding resistance. These photographs are not neutral. They were staged to project power. They were preserved to legitimize systems of exploitation. They were archived to erase the violence at the center of the frame. But they also contain evidence, small details that the people who commissioned them did not realize would one day be read against the grain. Documents visible in mirrors, objects held too tightly, faces that betray the cost of survival. Samuel Grant's story is one among thousands. Most will never be fully known, but each photograph that is reread, each archive that is reopened, each buried contract that is brought into the light is an act of recovery. It will not undo the harm. It will not restore the years stolen, but it insists that those lives mattered, that their resistance mattered, that the systems designed to erase them did not fully succeed. And it reminds us that history is not settled. It is constantly being rewritten by people willing to look more closely at what has always been there, hidden in plain sight.